Forget everything you think you know about arguments for God. Today, we're not talking about faith or scripture. We are diving into a modern argument that is built on pure, hard logic. It's a fascinating attempt to reason our way from the simple fact that we exist all the way to a necessary creator. So, where does this whole thing kick off? It starts with this incredibly deep, almost childlike question, famously posed by the philosopher Leibniz. Why is there something rather than nothing? I mean, really think about that. It's the ultimate mystery, and to even start to answer it, we're going to need a very specific philosophical tool.
And this is that tool. It's called the Principle of Sufficient Reason, or PSR for short. And it's actually a pretty simple, intuitive idea. Things don't just happen for no reason at all. Every single fact, every event, has some kind of explanation. This principle, it's the engine that's going to drive this entire line of thought.
Okay, so how in the world do we get from that simple principle all the way to a first cause? Well, philosophers Richard Gale and Alexander Pruss built this really sophisticated case. So let's break it down, step by step. Now, right off the bat, the argument does something really clever. It doesn't start by demanding that we accept that every single thing has an explanation. No, instead, it proposes a much weaker, much easier to swallow idea. For any given fact, it's at least possible that it has an explanation. It's a subtle move, but it's designed to get even a skeptic to kinda nod along. So you can see the difference laid out right here. The strong PSR is this really bold claim about what is true. The weak PSR, on the other hand, is way more modest. It's just a claim about what's possible. And the core of the argument is this complex logical proof that shows that if you just accept that an explanation is possible for the universe as a whole, it logically forces you to conclude that an explanation must actually exist. Okay, next big idea we need to get our heads around. I want you to imagine a giant cosmic book. And in this book is every single fact about our universe that could have been different, from the exact position of some random atom to the fact that you're listening to this right now. That entire collection, all of it rolled into one massive fact, is what philosophers call the big conjunctive contingent fact, or BCCF. Right, so here's the kicker. What explains this giant fact, the BCCF? Well, whatever the explanation is, it can't be just another contingent fact. Why? Because if it were, it would already be written inside that cosmic book it's supposed to be explaining. That's just talking in circles. So the explanation for all of contingent reality has to be something non-contingent. It has to be necessary. But just as we feel like we've arrived somewhere solid at a necessary cause, the argument slams into what looks like a brick wall, a truly devastating objection that threatens to bring the whole thing crashing down. And boy, is it a big one. And it's called the modal collapse objection. Here's the charge. If the PSR is true, then contingency is just an illusion. It would mean there's no free will, no other possibilities. Everything that happens had to happen. It basically suggests a completely deterministic universe, which to most of us just feels deeply wrong. Let's walk through the logic of this collapse, step by step. If the cause of our world is necessary, meaning it has to exist, and that cause logically leads to our world, then our world must also be necessary. But hold on a second. That's a huge contradiction. We started this whole thing by defining the BCCF as the sum of all contingent facts, things that could have been different. The argument seems to have tied itself into an impossible knot. But this is where Alexander Pruss pulls a philosophical rabbit out of a hat. He offers this incredibly ingenious way to save the argument from what really does look like a fatal flaw. Pruss's entire solution is to stop and challenge a hidden assumption that we've all been making. He asks a simple question. What if a good explanation doesn't have to force the outcome? What if it just has to make it understandable? And that one question changes everything. He makes this really crucial distinction between a necessitating reason, that's one that makes an outcome totally inevitable, and what he calls a sufficient explanation. See, a sufficient explanation just has to get rid of the mystery. It gives us a why, but it doesn't slam the door on the possibility that things could have turned out differently. Here's a great way to think about it, using an analogy from quantum mechanics. Scientists can explain why a particle decayed based on physical laws and probabilities. But those exact same laws didn't force it to decay at that precise nanosecond. The explanation is totally sufficient, it removes the mystery, but it isn't deterministic. So Press argues that the only type of explanation that can be ultimate, provide a sufficient reason, and not cause this dreaded modal collapse is one based on a free, rational choice, what philosophers call libertarian agency. It's a type of reason that explains without forcing the outcome. Okay, so we seem to have a necessary cause that freely chose to create our universe. But this just brings us to the next massive challenge, one that's often called the gap problem. How do we get from some abstract cause to a personal creator?
So the big question is, what is this necessary thing? Is it a mind, a person with intentions, or is it just some impersonal force, like a mathematical law or a physical principle? The argument absolutely has to bridge this gap.
When we explain things, we generally use one of two methods. Scientific explanations rely on laws and initial conditions. But here's the problem. Those laws and conditions, they're contingent facts themselves. They're inside that cosmic book, the BCFF, so they can't possibly explain the whole book. This really only leaves one other type of explanation on the table, a personal one, based on the choice of a free agent.
See, an impersonal cause just doesn't fit the bill for three big reasons. First off, if it's a necessary, unthinking force, then its effect would also have to be necessary. And bam, we're right back to that modal collapse problem. Second, an impersonal force can't choose to create this specific world out of all the other possibilities. And third, abstract objects like numbers are, well, powerless. The number 2 doesn't actually do anything. The only candidate left standing is a personal, conscious mind with free will.
Now, I know you might be thinking, okay, this is all very abstract philosophy, but Pruss argues that the stakes for rejecting this whole line of reasoning are unbelievably high, and they affect not just philosophy, but all of human knowledge. His final, and maybe his most powerful move, is to claim that if you throw out the principle of sufficient reason, you can't just stop there. He says that doing so opens the floodgates to a radical kind of skepticism that makes it pretty much impossible to trust anything. I mean, without the PSR, how do you really know that your experience of hearing me right now isn't just some random, uncaused hallucination? How do you know your entire life's memories didn't just pop into existence a second ago without any cause at all? If things can just happen for no reason, then the very foundation for science and even just basic perception completely crumbles. So the point here is that accepting the PSR isn't just a convenient premise for a theological argument. Pruss frames it as a precondition for being rational at all. In order to trust our own minds, we have to assume that the world is intelligible and that things happen for a reason. And that leaves us with one final massive question to chew on. Is the entire project of human reason, of science, of everything we do, implicitly betting on the existence of an ultimate explanation for everything? It's a profound thought, and it strikes right at the heart of why we believe anything at all.